In the fourth part of the Primitive Man tutorial, we now need to think of how we're going to get all of this geometry that we have on the left hand side that makes up the arm and also the leg onto the right hand side as quickly as possible, because we don't want to be replicating exactly the same process we've been through to get to the point we're now at. Fortunately, what we can do is use a couple of techniques in order to quickly duplicate it and place it on the correct side of the body. Initially then, we're going to duplicate all the geometry, and rather than going through every piece and saying Control D, what we can do is place everything inside a group. Now, grouping is a principle that's explained within its own related how-to video, but by grouping everything, what we're actually doing is creating a brand new transform node, and that means that we have control over everything that sits inside the group. Therefore, if I was to select all of the leg geometry, so you'll need to hold down Control and Shift as you just left-click drag through all of the geometry that has an underscore L on the end. Okay, we don't want to duplicate any of the central geometry, just the stuff on the outside. We can then say Edit and come down to Group. Alright, Group has its own shortcuts and it also has an option window. Now we'll just use the default option window. And one thing that I want to point out is that the pivot point of the group is going to be placed at the origin, and that's going to be a vital part when we get to the point of moving the geometry onto the right hand side. If I just select group, you can see now within the outliner that if I hold down Shift, left click on the plus, that all of the geometry is now contained within that hierarchy. So as I said, rather than going through each individual piece of geometry and duplicating them, all I need to do is select that group, hit Control and D. Gives me a brand new group, and if I open it up, I've got a duplication of every piece of geometry within inside. Now obviously we've got a slight issue with the naming convention, but that's alright, we'll come back to that in a moment. But as you can see, Group 2 has exactly the same pivot point as Group 1 as well. Okay, so if I take Group 2, I'm going to come to my channel box, and one of the fastest ways in which we can flip it or mirror this geometry across the Z-axis is to scale it in the direction of the X-axis. Okay, if you think about what we have, any value in this direction is going to be a +1. Okay, so if we wanted anything to be on this side, it needs to be a -1 in the X. So take my Group 2, come to the channel box, and just in scale X, I'm going to type in -1, hit enter, and it just flips it across. It scales everything, but this time in the other direction. So we now have a completed man. Okay, we've got 2 arms, 2 legs, and it's important that our pivot point was here when we did this scaling, because when you scale, it uses the pivot point in order to define where the scaling takes place from. If the pivot point was elsewhere, we wouldn't have got the perfect result. So again, if you are going to use this idea of symmetry in your modeling, you need to be very careful where your pivot points are and how accurate you are as well when you build. So we've got all of our geometry ready, but the problem is we've now got a duplication of names. Okay, I've got a hip joint L and I've got a hip joint L. The difference is, as before, when we originally looked at duplicated geometry, what happens is we get an additional number on the end. In the case of the geometry that we have, because we've duplicated the group rather than each individual piece, it doesn't actually rename anything within inside it. However, if we were to now remove all of the geometry from Group 2 and all of the geometry from Group 1, we'd run into a situation where we would get the duplicated name. So before we even do that, what I'm going to do is select all this geometry in Group 2. So I just left click there, hold down Shift and left click there, and it will select everything in between. And then under the Modify menu, we have an option called Search and Replace Names. So this is just going to allow us to quickly find anything that ends with an underscore L, and we're going to replace the underscore L with underscore R, okay, for the right hand side. Now if we wanted to, we could have just selected the group and done it hierarchically, or we could do it selected, because we have actually selected this. In either case, it doesn't make any difference. What I can do is just hit replace, and immediately we've got all of our geometry renamed. So you don't have to spend ages going through and typing it all in. It's just a very quick method of renaming a number of pieces of geometry. Okay, now we need to remove the geometry from those groups, and we can do that by selecting group 1, saying edit and ungroup. Okay, just reset the settings, hit ungroup. Okay, so if we come down here, all the geometry is now individual and not held within group 1 anymore. Another way in which we could have done that, because this is a hierarchy and essentially these are children of a parent, we could have selected them all and then used the hotkey Shift P to unparent, or that option can also be found under Edit, Unparent, Shift P. Okay, so two different methods of removing geometry from a group. The last one, unparent's more useful if you want pieces of geometry to be taken out of the group whilst others remain. The ungroup is good if you just want to remove everything. So here we are, we now have our primitive man basically complete. The next part of the video is creating hierarchies now between all the pieces of geometry. So when we rotate the shoulder as an example, everything moves with it.